It's very smoothly written and compassionate, and it's a very human tale whose voice, that of an African slave, successfully navigates time and is both accessible and authentic. The Moor's account was a finalist for the 2015 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction and a joint winner of the Arab American Book Award 2015. It made the Booker long list, and if you haven't read it, you have to, because as an historical novel, it's not only gorgeous and satisfying, a good read, but it's revolutionary, and we can discuss that wild claim a little later. Laila Lalami was born and raised in Morocco, in Rabat, and before the Moor's account, she wrote a short story collection, Hope and Other Dangerous Pursuits, which was a finalist for the Oregon Book Award, and the novel Secret Sun, which was on the Orange Prize long list. She teaches creative writing at the University of California at Riverside and has written essays and opinion pieces for the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, The Nation, The Guardian, and the New York Times. She is a recipient of the British Council Fellowship, a Fulbright Fellowship, and a Lannan Foundation Residency Fellowship. The Moor's account is a unique and exquisite retelling of the Narvaez expedition of 1528 that went to Florida. The expedition, which typically, for conquistadors, began as a quest for gold by 600 hungry Spaniards and ended with only 4 survivors, and is told through the eyes of Estevanico, a slave also known as Mustafa, and I'd prefer to call him Mustafa if you don't mind, who was brought to the so-called New World from his homeland in what is now Morocco. He began, so to speak, as a footnote in Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca's, or Cowhead's, self-aggrandizing memoirs, but through Lalami's deep research and insightful characterizations, Estevanico, the slave, or Mustafa, is realized as a human being. So I'm going to stop here and let Laila take it up, and I'd like you to take it up from that place of that footnote and how you sort of discovered Estevanico and how you fleshed him out into a real human being.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I confess I always get very embarrassed, even though I've done the things that you say I did, but it's always very embarrassing to hear one's bio being read. But thank you all for coming, and thank you, William and Amita, for inviting me to speak here. About 6 years ago, I was reading a book called We Are All Moors by the Moroccan scholar Anwar Majid. And it's a very interesting book whose argument, if I may summarize it, is that the image that we have today of the immigrant finds its roots in 16th century Spain, 15th century Spain, in the image of the Moor as being the ultimate other, the stranger, the foreigner, the person who's different from us. And so therefore we define ourselves with respect to how different we are from that Moor. And about halfway through the book, Anwar mentions a Moroccan slave whom he said was the first African explorer of America. And it was a very short mention of a couple of paragraphs, but as soon as I read it, I thought, well, wait a minute. Who is this guy and why haven't I heard of him? I mean, I was born and raised in Morocco. I went to high school there. And I would have remembered if something as extraordinary as a Moroccan explorer of America had been mentioned in any of our history books. And so I wanted to find out more about him. And so I bought this book called Chronicle of the Narvaez Expedition, which is part of the Penguin Classics series. It's a very slim book that I highly recommend. And it was written by Cabeza de Vaca. And I had heard about Cabeza de Vaca vaguely, but I definitely hadn't heard about this Moroccan explorer. So I read the Chronicle of the Narvaez Expedition, and I was immediately fascinated by the story, even though prior to that I had had very little interest in Spanish conquistadors, but I was fascinated by that story, first of all, because it was such an unmitigated disaster. Now, of course, we all know the stories of success, stories like Hernan Cortés, or Christopher Columbus, but we don't hear about the many dozens of other expeditions that went to the New World and never amounted to anything. And that failure actually interested me much more. So you've heard that there were initially 600 men, women, and children who left the port of Sanlúcar de Barrameda in Seville in 1527, headed for the New World. And the goal of the expedition was to conquer Florida for the Spanish crown. And when they landed, the governor of this expedition, Narvaez, decided to split the expedition into two and sent 300 of the party to go wait for them at the nearest Spanish port, and he took the other 300 inland to look for gold. The reason he had made that decision is because he felt very confident in the outcome, and he thought that it would not take very long to find the gold, and he felt. The best way I can put it is that he felt superior because he had the horses and he had the ammunition and he had the supplies and he had the Bible and he had all these things that made them very confident of the success of their expedition. When I was reading that, I was thinking about the beginning of the Iraq War, right? About how confident people were that it was going to be, well, not people, but a specific people in the administration that thought it wasn't going to take very long to find those famous weapons of mass destruction. But so there, of course, there was no gold, and within a short order, there were only 4 survivors. And so what attracted me to this story is that it's a story of transformation, that the conquerors within a year become the conquered, and that in order to survive, they all have to dress like indigenous people, live among indigenous people, act like indigenous people. And so it is a story about sort of a change in your identity or modifying it in order to be able to survive in an unfamiliar environment. It's also a story of adventure because the men basically cross North America and live among these tribes for 8 years, and also because they reinvent themselves as faith healers. So that too was kind of fascinating. But the reason, all of that would be really interesting to read about in any book. But when you read about the Moroccan slave, the reason I went to this narrative in the first place, one thing that stood out to me in the Chronicle of the Narvaez expedition is that Estevanico, for that is how the men call him, is mentioned only a handful of times, oftentimes in relation to his skin color, so en negro, or in relation to his function, or the slave, or his status rather. In spite of the fact that he became their scout and he also learned indigenous languages and made it possible for the others to communicate with indigenous people. So he played a very crucial role, and yet he's mentioned only a few times. Part of the reason for that is that when the men were eventually brought to Mexico City, the seat of the Spanish Empire, and were asked to provide testimony about what had happened, the 3 Spanish noblemen who had survived were deposed and gave their testimony to the official court. But because he was a slave, Estebanico's testimony was never recorded. And as soon as I discovered that aspect of the story, I was hooked, because can you imagine hearing about this whole history that Cabeza de Vaca has saved for us in the Chronicle of the Narvaez expedition, but from the point of view of the one member of the expedition whose testimony was never recorded. And I felt also that his position as an outsider, as an interloper, as someone who is neither a conqueror nor somebody who's being conquered in that particular moment, I found that to be intriguing and fascinating, and that's what drew me to the story. So as soon as I finished reading the Chronicle of the Narvaez expedition, I knew I had to write a novel from his point of view. But trailing that thought came another thought, which is that I can't do it because I knew nothing about Spanish exploration of the Americas, and still less about, in general, what happens when conquistadors land in Florida. Nothing at all about that whole part of history. So it was a very interesting 5 years after that, with a lot of research and being curled up in a fetal position under a desk. And so anyway, but it's all behind me now. It's done. The book is out, and so it's over.
I think that you were pretty restrained about describing how the conquistadors were, well, they were very, very, we all know this, very brutal. They were torturous and pretty awful, but the book, as I read it, you brought a lot of humor to them, you brought a lot of humanity, and you actually were restrained in describing their brutality. I think there are only 2 or 3 places where they become who we all know and love. So, do you want to talk a little about that and why?
Yeah, I'm actually kind of surprised to hear you say this, because if anything, readers have come up to me and said, "Oh, but it is so violent. It is so. These episodes are so violent." And I wasn't quite sure what to say to that, because of course the business of conquest is going to be violent. And I felt, if anything, I had tamed it. I really presented only a couple of places where it was really violent.
Where
and the
it's
rest of it-
violent,
yeah,
you
yeah.
make it violent. That's not a question.
Yeah.
It's the
But
amount.
it's interesting. But it's. I mean, I've gotten a couple of emails from somebody saying, "Well, do you know for a fact that they use torture?" Well, in Cabeza de Vaca's narrative, he will say things like, "We took 2 Indians. We took 2 Indians and had them take us to the next village." Well, how do you suppose that they took them, or how do you suppose that they compelled them to move from village to village? Of course, that there had to be coercion. But one of the books that really opened my eyes to the depravity of that particular moment of history is a book called The Conquest of New Spain by Bernal Díaz del Castillo, which is a book that I highly recommend. And in it, so Bernal Díaz was an eyewitness to Hernán Cortés's conquest of New Spain. And it is a fascinating book because he will talk about, the mundane aspects, like the day-to-day, what they did on a day-to-day basis. And it's very boring for, 10 or 20 pages. And then suddenly there's a skirmish, and you will hear, and he will write things like, "Oh, and we took the body of a fat Indian, cut it up, and used the fat as a salve for our wounds." And then he will move on to something else. And
Little
so
Auschwitz-y.
it's a book that really brought home for me the quotidian aspect of that torture. And I wanted to sort of bring that into this book. So there's a couple of scenes of torture, but if anything, it's very understated. I knew that it would be very difficult to read something that where it was unrelenting violence, and so one of the things that I did with this book is kind of intersperse the story of the expedition with the story of Mustafa himself, because we know so little about him. We know only that he's an Arabic-speaking black man who is from this town called Moor, which is south of Casablanca in Morocco. And that's it. And we know he's the slave of Andrés Dorantes. And that's it. And so I wanted the story of the Narvaez expedition to be just one part of the story of his life, right? So he exists outside of the boundaries of that expedition. So he's not entirely defined by it. There's a lot more going on about his life. And so the one thing that was great about that is that it enabled me to write about the story of conquest, but it's not quite just about that, it's also about him.
Yeah, it very much is. And I was curious what you read and what you went to find out about those times in what's now Morocco.
Yeah. So I had to read about 16th century Morocco, and that was a really interesting period of Moroccan history, because at that time the seat of power was in Fez, and there was a kingdom called Kingdom of Fez, and the Sultan there spent his time trying to keep all the other neighboring tribes, under his control. So the country was very much divided at the beginning of the 16th century. And that coincided also with the beginning of the Spanish and Portuguese empires. So at that time, the Portuguese were establishing trading posts all along the African continent. And of course, Morocco being nearest, that's one of the places where they started doing that. And that's also the beginning of the slave trade, which is how he becomes enslaved and how he ends up part of the expedition. So I read a lot about the historical context of Estevanico. So, for example, I learned that a couple of years before we think he landed in Spain, there was a major drought in the Ducala region, which is where Moor is. And the Ducala is known as the breadbasket of Morocco. This is where most of the grain is grown. And the drought was so severe that it led to mass starvation, which is why we think that a number of Moroccans ended up in slavery. At one point, 60,000 Moroccan women were transported to Portugal as slaves and concubines. So it was a very educational process for me as a Moroccan to read about that. But at the end of the day, I still had to create a character. So, there's only so much research you can do, right? So you can research, and there is this wonderful term called research rapture, which is where you just fall in love with your research, and suddenly you find this really interesting tidbit, and there goes 3 days worth of research. So you can continue doing that literally for years, but you still have to write a story, and a story is not research. So I had to take a leap and create this character. And so for me, that came also at the level of voice. I wanted him to sound like a man of his era. I didn't want him to sound like a man who had been written in the 21st century, but that a man who was from the 16th century and that his voice is coming to us from there. So that was part of the work that I had to do, is just to focus on creating the character, because a lot of these things may seem to us, especially in 2015, as being very exotic and very different from us, right? Who goes to another country looking for gold? Who makes such a basic mistake as to send half of his party down to the next port? But on the other hand, the impulses that drive these expeditions have not changed, not one bit. So we still have the greed, we still have the lust, we still have the jealousy, we still have competition between members of any endeavor, right? So those things were what opened the book up for me, because I had to always constantly go back to the emotions. What drove so-and-so to do this? What drove Estevanico to do that? And that, in creating the character, that was the bulk of the work of the novel. Even though, it did involve a lot of research, but that was the easier aspect of it.
Margaret Atwood said that she knew she was avoiding writing the book when the research had piled up over her.
Yes, I believe that, yeah.
I was struck a couple of years ago by an historian named an English historian named David Starkey, who said that it's ludicrous to suggest that historical novelists have authority, and I don't believe that. What do you think?
I think that ludicrous to suggest that historical novelists have any authority. I think it's ludicrous to suggest that history has any authority.
Nicely put. Well put.
Because history is, to my mind at least, something that's very malleable. And it can be written and rewritten, and yet rewritten to suit, whichever purposes we have for it. So, there are so many examples, I don't even know where to begin. But I'll give you a couple of examples. One from Morocco, for example, where it's a country that was under French occupation for 44 years, between 1912 and 1956. And so whenever you have the story of independence, you're going to have the story of resistance, and how did people manage to win their independence. If you look at textbooks in Morocco now, it's called The Revolution of the King and the People. And forgive me, but I think that the revolution is something that the people do, because the people had to bear the brunt of what that resistance meant. They were the ones who were being shot at by the French whenever they resisted. But it's called that in our textbooks because obviously the Moroccan government and the Moroccan regime in general want to cement this idea that the king and the people were fighting together against the French, even though the French at one point had appointed the Sultan in Morocco. So this is what I mean by saying that history is malleable. And who knows, maybe in 50 years the history of Morocco will look very different. And another part of it now, you can look at what happened with the Iraq War. I always keep going back to it. But But initially we were told that the reason that the Iraq War had to happen was because Saddam Hussein presented a clear and present danger to the United States and that he had these weapons of mass destruction. About a month into the war, then it became about regime change, and now we're 12 years removed from the beginning of the Iraq War, and nobody seems to remember that that's why we went. But the reason that it's being fought is because we have this existential threat coming from Islamic fundamentalists. So who knows, maybe in 10 years it'll be written about in yet another way. And so I do think that history is malleable. So to suggest that historical novelists have no authority might be a little bit exaggerated. I think all history is fiction. I think all history is fiction. And I think that it's fiction based on fact, just as my book is based on fact. But I think that the reason that I call it fiction is because history is not an objective accounting of what happened. Yes, you have facts, right? So you can say, this thing happened in this year, and this person invaded that country in this. So these are facts that we can all agree on, but I think of history as the glue that holds these facts together. The story that we shape these facts into, that's what counts as history. And so to a certain extent, because you are shaping those facts into a particular story, then that is a fiction. That is...
well, history belongs to the victor.
Yes.
Right? And so, you somewhere in there, fiction is merging and colliding with fiction, and then, fact and fiction are merging, and it becomes this sort of soup that, in fact, is its own reality.
Yeah. I mean, I think, and where I would distinguish fiction from history is that, of course, in fiction you can make it all up completely and utterly because you're completely freed. You're using your imagination to do that. But I just wanted to question the idea that history is this sort of, pristine account of what has happened. That's really what I wanted to say. And I think one of the advantages of writing fiction is that you're freed from having to tell it from the received point of view or from the point of view of the victor, usually. So you can tell it from any point of view that you like. And in this particular case, it's told from the point of view of one person whose story was never recorded. Surely, if Dorantes were to tell his story of the expedition, it would be very different than the story that Cabeza de Vaca wrote. We think of Cabeza de Vaca's story as being history only because it was published in 1542, so he beat everyone else to publication. And so whatever he told us happened for the Narvaez expedition is what we consider the history of the Narvaez expedition. But we don't know. None of us were there. And certainly the other three members did not publish their accounts of what happened. And in addition to that, Cabeza de Vaca had a very, very specific agenda in writing that book. He wanted to have a license from the King of Spain, or to earn a license from the King of Spain to become governor of Argentina. So he would hardly be considered a completely neutral observer of that expedition, because it was in his interest to present himself as positively as positively as possible. That sounds weird, to the King of Spain, because, he needs that license. So the way in which he writes it has an agenda. So I guess the way that I could summarize the whole thing, if I can bring it all up to the same point, which is that anybody who tells you a story has an agenda. And so just remember that even history has its own agenda, not just fiction.
Do you know of other African or non-white, in the research you did you find other African or non-white contributors to the conquest
and that's another thing that was really interesting about writing this book, is to sort of realize how the myth of a conquest is that it was something that was done by white men, particularly Spanish men that went and conquered, Mexico. But in fact, these expeditions were very multicultural, multilingual endeavors. So you had not just Spanish and Portuguese, but oftentimes people who had come from other parts of Europe and North Africa. There were indentured servants. There were slaves from all over Africa, freedmen even. And then you also had women and children. So they were more multicultural than what we remember.
Must have been very few women and children, because the conquistadors had many relationships here
Yes.
and went home to their spouses
Yes,
and their,
so-
which is unlike the conquest of North America, where whole families came.
Right.
And settled and committed huge, actually probably more genocide.
Yes, yes. Now that's true. I mean, there weren't many, but there were women, of course. Yes.
Wow. Well, we could do questions and answers. Would you like that?
Yes,
Or,
that would be great.
or I could ask you things like the New York Times, what's on your nightstand? What are you reading? And what is on your nightstand? So, your choice. Actually, I'd like to know what's on your nightstand.
Well, I just finished a graphic novel by a Syrian-French artist named Riyad Sattour. The graphic novel is called The Arab of the Future, and is about being sent to Libya and Syria in the 1970s, because his father had a PhD in history and really believed in Pan-Arabism and wanted to go and teach in the Arab world. And so this half-French, half-Syrian boy, arrives in Libya, and it's about his experiences of living under dictatorship in both Libya and Syria. So it's very topical, and that's the one that I just finished. I'm trying to think about what else I read before that. Oh, I read Purity by Jonathan Franzen before that. So.
And you're writing a new book, of course.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And are you going to tell us about it? Or you don't have to. I mean, these things can be talked away, so...
It will have fewer scenes of torture than
the Moor's account is very male.
Yes, now is my time to come out of the closet and reveal how I'm actually a dude. Isn't it interesting? When the book was sent out to editors, one of the editors wrote back and said, "I really enjoyed this book. However, it is very masculine." And I thought, it is from the point of view of a man, so that's kind of the point. But it's interesting. I mean, I guess because it is a story about exploration. It is a story about, it's the hero's journey. So I guess it is prototypically a male story, if you wish. I guess that's why people think of it that way. Yeah.
Let's open it up.
Yes.
Okay, readers. Yeah. Would you stand and we can hear you?
I've never done this. The remark you just made about an editor receiving your book and exclaiming in horror, I suppose, that it was very masculine. Do you think that's because the editors or the folks in the publishing world expect that since you're a woman writer, that it should be nice and should avoid that, quote, whatever that means, masculine tinge or point of view?
Yeah, I mean, I've been asked that pretty regularly. I think that's why. It's because you're a woman, and so people expect that you're going to be writing from the point of view of a woman. And if you don't, then you get asked why you write from the point of view of a man. And I mean, I'm not sure why that is. I mean, I think the whole point of writing fiction is that you get to exercise your imaginative empathy. I have no interest in writing about a middle-aged Moroccan woman. None whatsoever. That might be something other people might be interested in, but I live it every day, and when I write, I'd like to know what it's like to live other lives. And so it's not that I set out to write a man, it's just that this story, when I came across it, I know it sounds cuckoo, but I really did feel called to write it, and I felt like I had to write it, I had the skills to write it, and I had the ambition, and I had to write it, and so the fact that it was from the point of view of a man was like the least of my of my concerns. But I have been asked, because of this book, people have gone back to the other books and like, well, the previous one was also from the point of view of a man, and oh, by the way, in your story collection, half of the characters are men, and so it just seems very strange that people are going around counting how many, how many characters you write from whatever. I've written plenty of women characters, but apparently, I'm supposed to only write what I know, I guess. I don't know. So I think that's probably why. I think it's because it breaks this expectation. And also because, let's face it, the story of conquest is such a male-dominated world. And so I think that's part of why. I was asked about that.
Let's go over here.
Over here, yeah.
Laura?
Imaginative empathy. So basically, I guess what I mean by that is when you're writing, so this is the killer app of writing, is that it is the only form, like for me, the only art form where you actually get to know what it's like to be another human being. Like if you look at a painting or if you watch a movie, you're kind of looking at it from the outside. But when you're reading, you're creating your own images in your head as you're reading. So you are entering the thoughts of another human being. So it is like being in the body, in another body. So by imaginative empathy, what I mean is experiencing somebody else in that way, and doing that without judgment. In other words, writing another person as if I were writing myself. So that doesn't mean not being aware of one's faults, but also, you know how you make your own. You forgive yourself about certain things, and maybe you don't forgive yourself about other things, but you are always going to write with a certain amount of empathy about yourself, right? So that's what it means. Can you do that with another character? Can you do that with another person? And to me, the job of fiction is to nurture that side of yourself. I think what's his name? Michael Ondaatje was saying is it has to do with the tenderness towards the self and the other, I think is how he put it. So it's writing the other with tenderness, I guess would be the best way to put it.
Jim?
Thank you. I'm sorry, I came in a few minutes late,
It's
so
okay.
I'm not sure if I'm asking something that you might already
That's all
have
right.
commented on. Two questions. One, I've spent most of my life teaching film, so I'm just wondering if you used or learned anything from Herzog's great film, Aguirre, The Wrath of God.
Yes.
And secondly, what you drew from the Cabeza de Vaca journal itself in relation to what you wrote.
Yeah. So the Herzog movie I have not seen, although people keep telling me I should see it. I know. Nobody's perfect.
There's so much time, so much art.
And then about the Cabeza de Vaca story, at every juncture, so the wonderful thing about that book is that it gives you so it gives you kind of an itinerary. This is where they started and this is where they ended up. And you have descriptions of the journey that they went through. So that was my sort of my basic outline. So I had an idea of where I needed to end up by the end of the book, or at least by a certain part of the book. But at every juncture, wherever I felt that my character would have looked at things differently, I took that opportunity and took it differently. And part of the reason is that, as I mentioned earlier, when Cabeza de Vaca wrote that story, he had his own agenda. So in the same way, when my character is writing this story, he's going to write it with his own agenda. And so at every juncture, we are told the story. There are certain things that are different about it, but everything else remains the same. I mean, they still land in Florida. There's still cannibalism. There's still all kinds of things that happen that are the same between both books, but the way in which they're told is very different. And certainly the ending is very different. So there's quite a few differences, but it still is believable within what we know about what the Narvaez expedition did. Oh, there's another person in the back.
Yes.
It seems to me you're a great candidate to write about what is happening in Middle East and Islam and what have you. And Americans, especially after Afghanistan and Iraq, are now curious. But it's the culture, it's the LA and the movies and writers who need to be translators. Have you considered actually writing something that will shed more light about, from your perspective, what's happening in that part of the world, Islam, Middle East, Arabs, what have you?
It's interesting that you use the word Islam to refer to a geographical region because, I mean, it's certainly one of the meanings of the word. And I think that that's a meaning that gets lost a lot of times because when people talk about Islam, they talk about it as the religion, as though there is only one Islam. And in fact, the word means the religion, the faith, and the multiple different forms of that faith. It means the culture, it means Islamic civilization through history, and it means the geographical region. So it is a very, very complicated word, but as we've seen, especially from Donald Trump's recent forays, it is a word that has become shorthand for everything that's other, everything that's different, everything that threatens us against them. So, but anyway, I have written about the Middle East and North Africa, but in nonfiction. So I've written quite a few pieces, political commentary and opinion pieces, but not in the form of fiction. Possibly in this next book there might be some reference to this Iraq War, but if it is, it will remain in the background. I feel like it's still a little too recent to be written about in fiction, but we'll see. I mean, I think we're starting to see some fiction come out of that war. I don't know if any of you have read some of the recent crops of war books that have been coming out. But yeah, so I've only written about it in nonfiction, not in fiction.
We have about 4 minutes left.
There's a lady in the back that's been...
The lady in the back, yes.
Hi. I was wondering, at what age did you start writing? And I teach high school English, and I'm currently teaching my kids about voice, and you mentioned voice. I wondered if you had any words of wisdom for inspiring young writers.
I started writing when I was 9 years old. But in the way that any kids write, it's because, I came to writing through reading. I became a writer because I was a reader first. I grew up in a house full of books. I read my entire life. That was all I've done with my free time. So it was something that I always enjoyed doing. And about the age of 9, I started wanting to replicate that experience by writing my own stories. But really, I only became serious about writing in my mid to late 20s. That's when I took it up seriously. And as far as inspiring young writers, I think what I would tell them is to read, and to read eclectically. People always ask me, what is your advice about writing? And I always say reading, and it sounds really boring, but it really is. It really is. Everything is through reading. I think it was Cormac McCarthy that said, books are made out of other books. And it was something that has always resonated with me. So I would tell them to read, but also I would tell them that that if they feel the urge to do it, that they have to stick with it. Because I think that one of the things that we see, unfortunately, is that not all stories are treated in the same way. So some stories are considered more valuable than others. And I think one of the things that I struggle with my undergraduates particularly, is that they don't see their voices reflected in the mainstream. And so they think, therefore, their stories are not valuable, or who would care about what we have to say. And so if you feel that if you have the urge to tell stories, and if you feel like you have something that is important to say, then you should work and keep working until it is said. So that's what I would tell them. Oh, there's another person in the back.
I think we're just about done. Oh, there's another. I'm sorry. Please, yes. Yep.
I have a question.
1 minute.
1 minute. Quick question. Very quick.
I feel like I should say, and the answer is 22.
You have to spell that.
Yes. Ask it away. I'm sure I can hear you.
I have a question about the statement you made, history can lack authority because it is malleable. And yet I find that most of your fiction seems to be driven by history.
I said that history is malleable in the sense that if you look at it if you look at it in the course of 300 years or 200 years or 100 years, you see that the story is not being told in the same way in each of these intervals. That's what I meant by that. But I did not mean to suggest that history is not a mighty force in our lives and that in some way we are always in relationship to it. Of course, yes, that's true. And part of the reason of wanting to write this book is to challenge the accepted history of what happened to the Narvaez expedition. Otherwise, there would be no point in writing the novel. The whole conceit of the book is that it's giving us a perspective on the Narvaez expedition that we have not gotten before. Yeah.
All right, that's it. Thank you very much.